14-year-old, I was mortified about the destructive power we had to end civilization many times over. Yet I was also fascinated by the twisted logic of mutually assured destruction. That is, if you threaten me and you attack me, I'm going to attack you and we'll all lose. So no one dares make the first move. To me, that was brilliant but twisted when you think about the implications of nuclear war. And since then, as a high school student in Australia, I went to the United States, I finished my studies, and now I'm president of Ploughshares Fund. As Francis mentioned, we are the largest foundation in the United States solely dedicated to reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, right now, we're in a critical moment when it comes to nuclear weapons. We are on the precipice of a new nuclear arms race. We're about to undo all of the good work that we did at the end of the Cold War on reducing the world's number of nuclear weapons from between 60 to 70,000 down to around 12,000 today. For the first time in decades, the world is about to have more nuclear weapons than it has recently, and there's a new nuclear arms race beginning. And that's why it's critical that we address this topic. Now, thinking about nuclear weapons is hard. It's overwhelming, it's daunting, and I understand why many people would prefer to think that other people smarter than they in government are working on this issue. That is right, but it's also an issue that affects us all, and we cannot afford to stay complacent and bury our heads in the sand while the world engages on a new nuclear arms race. And there are things you and we can do, but we have to do them together. So we're ready to meet this moment. It's going to require cooperation, it's going to require partnership, dedication and creativity. But it's critically important, and I think we can do it. And that's why, for me, it's a real honour to be here today at the Rotary International Convention, because as I've walked around the room, I see so many issues and causes that really relate to the values that Ploughshares has as a nuclear threat reduction organisation, and I see the connections and the interconnectivity between so many of the issues that Rotarians care about and what we work on so deeply. That's to do with peace, it's to do with water and the environment, and it's to do with women and children. Put simply, the issues that you care about deeply have a relationship with nuclear weapons. So let me tell you how. I think the most obvious connection here is on the peace front. We've seen recently how Vladimir Putin has used nuclear threats to invade a sovereign country, to perpetrate horrendous war crimes affecting women, children, and men as well. We've seen how this has resulted in a refugee crisis and impacted the world economy. And nuclear weapons have enabled him. We also see how China is looking to increase its number of nuclear weapons to try to get to parity to the same numbers as the United States and Russia. And we see how North Korea is testing more advanced nuclear missiles that could carry nuclear weapons. And really alarmingly, we're seeing in South Korea, a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons right now, where there's the majority of the population thinks that South Korea should get nuclear weapons of its own. The United States as well is talking about increasing its number of nuclear weapons. There are many in the United States talking about that as a response to what's happening with Russia. And all of this adds up to more countries with nuclear weapons, more nuclear weapons, and a greater chance of something going terribly wrong, either on purpose or quite likely by accident, miscalculation, and misunderstanding. So that's on the peace front. Let's look at some of the other issues that Rotarians care about on the environment. So when we look at nuclear weapons, they have had a devastating impact on the environment, even though we've only had 2 weapons used in wartime. The production, the testing, the uranium mining, all of the things that help develop nuclear weapons have had a horrible impact on the environment. We see in the United States the impact on water and the contaminated drinking water in some parts of the United States, rivers near sites that produce the plutonium for the weapon that was dropped on Nagasaki, contaminated, and people developing cancer at extraordinary rates. There are many other aspects of the environment that have been affected, and we also see how women and children particularly are impacted by nuclear weapons production and testing and use. Let's look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Women there who survived the bombings were almost twice as likely to develop cancer and die from cancer because of ionizing radiation. They were almost more than twice as likely than men to die from that. And we also see in Chernobyl, studies from after Chernobyl, that girls were much more likely to develop thyroid cancer than boys. And thinking about somewhere where nuclear weapons weren't used, but they were tested, takes us to the Marshall Islands. And we hear horrific, heartbreaking stories of the jellyfish babies. These are babies born to women who were the victims, were around during the atomic testing by the United States in the 40s and 50s, whose children were born with transparent skin and no bones. They usually didn't survive more than a few days after childbirth. Now, these stories and statistics are harrowing, but these are the impacts that have come from just production of nuclear weapons, use in war twice, and testing. We're not even talking about a nuclear exchange or a nuclear war. It's unfathomable to think about what the consequences might be of a full-blown nuclear war. And I think we only need to look back a few years to the beginning of the pandemic to recognise the kind of impact that a world earth-shattering event can have, how it can disrupt our daily life, make things much more difficult in ways we couldn't imagine. I don't know what it would be like if we had a nuclear war. What we do know, though, is that it would be very hard for organisations like the Red Cross or governments to go into a zone where nuclear weapons had been used and people were suffering. They were still alive, but suffering. There'd be no way to help them. And we know that even with a limited nuclear exchange, that could affect the atmosphere. It could result in a cooling of the atmosphere, which could result in crop production taking longer, which could result in global famine. And we know that radiation plumes of smoke know no borders. And if we were to have a nuclear war or detonation in one place, the radiation could travel far and wide, affecting those not even involved in the conflict. So these are pretty depressing statistics. Let's turn in another direction for a minute, though. When we think about the next generation that inherits this mess and these challenges, we often look to the next generation and say they will solve the world's problems. And it's a bit challenging because in doing that, we're effectively saying our generation has failed. We're going to leave it up to the next generation, which feels a bit defeatist and a bit depressing. But I actually take a lot of heart in the next generation. We do know that they're concerned about this issue. They do think that nuclear war is likely within a decade. A decade. We think about these things we haven't had to worry about for a decade, and now our young people are concerned there'll be nuclear war within 10 years. But they're also a very hopeful group of people. We know they are motivated to take action. They're not waiting to be told by the powers that be that they can act. They see this as in their future, and they believe that even one small action by one person can lead to real impact and change. And we just see this when we look at younger people working on issues like climate change, like racial justice. And it's the same for nuclear weapons. We see now that there are groups of younger people working on this nuclear issue, the Youth Nuclear Forums. And what we need to do is we need to be learning from them. We need to be letting them take the lead, and we need to be bearing in mind that this work is important because it affects them and their futures. So, doing this work for the next generation is a well-worn cliche. But doing this work with the next generation is the way forward. So what can you do? You might be feeling a bit depressed after all of this talk. But there are things that you can do. You can get educated. You can educate others. You can engage those younger people who are so primed and ready to act. Learn about nuclear weapons today. Learn about the impacts and the implications of this new nuclear arms race that we're about to embark on. And learn from organisations like Ploughshares Fund. I think we'll be handing around some flyers a bit later. And you might be thinking, well, what can I do? Why, I'm one person, can I really make a difference? Well, I'm sure there were people back in the nuclear freeze movement, in the United Kingdom, for example, who might have had the same thought. That we see how demonstrations and activism and action in Western Europe was more influential on decisions made by the Reagan administration than the American protests in Central Park. So there is strength in global efforts that put pressure on the powers that be to make the right decisions. There are also other things you can do. We look over here at this Peace Park and we see the wonderful trees with the cranes. Now, I'm not sure if you all know, but these cranes are very symbolic. They represent a young woman, Sadako Sasaki, who was born in Hiroshima, survived the detonations. She was 2. 10 years later, she passed away because of the radiation. But before she died, she folded 1,000 paper cranes that symbolise her wish to live. And since then, children around the world have made paper cranes in her honour, and to symbolise their wishes come true for a better future. And every year in August, which is coming up, Ploughshares Fund and our partners and our friends fold paper cranes in her honour and in our vision of a safer world, of a world without nuclear weapons, of a world that is safe and secure, but without threatening annihilation of people on the other side of the globe. So I encourage you to join us, join all of your friends here in Sadako's honour and say, we demand better. Don't be satisfied with the status quo. Tell the powers that be that we reject a new nuclear arms race, that we will not live under the spectre of nuclear war, and that we demand and we deserve a better world, a stronger world, a bolder world, and one that's more courageous, because the stakes are so high for us and our future generations, and we deserve it. Thank you.